going to share my screen and start with just a musical piece that will allow us to just have a little bit of time of reflection as the beeps. I don't know how to turn the beeps off on this, but we'll just reflect and let as folks join.
okay. Sounds so predictable.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am going to invite Mike Corey to open us in a word of prayer.
My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to our chapel service and this third, I believe, week in June. I've been looking forward to today's chapel for some time because today we welcome a guest speaker who I think I'm discovering is known to many of you from some of the chat before we officially started. But Dr. Brandon Nappy is the founder and executive director at the Copper Beech Institute nearby in West Hartford. They do amazing work. You should definitely check out their programming. Dr. Nappy is also adjunct faculty at Yale Divinity, where he earned his MDiv and a doctoral degree from Aquinas Theological Seminary. And we are honored to have him with us today. And so I am going to turn this over with welcome to Dr. Nappy.
Thank you, David. It's a blessing to be here among so many friends and colleagues, and the work and the study and the prayer that happens at Hartford Seminary is something that I really, really cherish and appreciate. It's needed more than ever. So thank you for this invitation. I'm incredibly humbled, and I'm going to share my screen. I know some folks might be visual learners. And so we'll learn and pray together with Thomas Merton today, which I hope might be, who I hope might be a helpful guide to us in these moments. And we'll be working with a prayer, a poem that he wrote in 1961, an excerpt of a prayer called Hagios Sophia, which I thought might be grounding for us. I think more than ever, we need communities of conviction, like Hartford Seminary, a community of healers that are dedicated to repairing the world. We need folks dedicated to the reconciliation of stillness and prayer on the one hand, and social action on the other. And Merton, even in his life as a monk and a hermit, was incredibly dedicated to both the contemplative life and to social action in a way that feels really fresh even today, and feels like a really powerful encouragement, at least it is to me in my own life. So we already began praying Merton's famous prayer. I saw in the chat box, it's a beloved prayer to someone, and it's been to me in my own life. I spent much of my my academic career in theology trying to understand Merton's heart and his quest to reconcile contemplation and action. And so we're going to work with one of his poems in a form of Christian contemplative prayer called Lectio Divina, which is a form of contemplative prayer that I believe can be prayed by by any within any faith tradition, and even by a person without any formal faith tradition. But before we do that, what I'd love to do is just maybe for those who don't know much about Merton, I could share just a couple of little tidbits just to kind of contextualize Merton's life. So Merton was born to a New Zealand Episcopalian father and a Quaker mother who were both artists in France. He settled and lived most of his early childhood in England. His mother died at an early age. He went to Cambridge University and had a disastrous freshman year, fathered a child, was likely an alcoholic, depressed, and was rescued by his grandparents who were living in Flushing, New York, and later in Queens, who sponsored him. And his father died, and so he was somewhat of an orphan as he began his college career at Columbia in Manhattan. He was an atheist, practically speaking, though he was baptized Episcopalian. And he had a kind of awakening by reading Etienne Gilson's Spirit of Medieval Philosophy in his sophomore or junior year at Columbia. And he rather dramatically not only was rebaptized as a Catholic, but Merton, prone to kind of intensity, a couple of years later, after teaching English at St. Bonaventure's University, goes on to Gethsemane Abbey, the Trappist monastery in Kentucky, at the time among the most intense and severe paths within Catholic Christianity, and enters in 1941. By the time the war is over, the monastery is swelled to over 300 monks, and Merton is feeling this need for further solitude, and lives out much of his late life writing in a hermitage behind the monastery, and becomes, at least in the Christian world, one of the foremost respected spiritual writers in the English language. His book, Seven Story Mountain, in 1949 becomes an international bestseller, and at least in Catholic homes, Merton becomes a bit of a celebrity, and Christians are reading, ordinary Catholics anyway, are reading much more deeply about the contemplative life than ever before. Through the 50s, he's having correspondences with rock stars and poets and heads of state and religious leaders. He's incredibly committed to interreligious dialogue within, especially with the Buddhist community, with the Muslim community, with Christian leaders of nearly every denomination. I thought that would be particularly helpful to understand. This is one of his passions. This is the hermitage that he wrote from. And I share this image in particular because it emphasizes both his deep commitment to a life of solitude. He lived most of his life in those four walls, and yet he was on the forefront of speaking out in support of social action, of civil rights, of nuclear disarmament, speaking out against the war in Vietnam. Famously, the CIA had Thomas Merton on their watch list. And so he becomes a great kind of mentor to us in moments like this. And for those of you who I know cherish interreligious dialogue at Hartford Seminary, I just wanted to point out these two really beautiful photos that are dear to me. One of the very young Thich Nhat Hanh, the very famous Zen Buddhist leader who is still alive today. Both Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh entered the seminary and entered the monastery in the same year, though you can tell Thich Nhat Hanh was much younger when he did so. So they were connected early in the monastic life. And then this beautiful image of the Dalai Lama placing some flowers at the grave of Thomas Merton, who died in Bangkok attending a conference and giving a paper on monastic interreligious dialogue. And the Dalai Lama and Merton were dialogue partners through the through the 60s before Merton passed away. So a little context. There's so much more to say about my hero Thomas Merton, but that will need to be as much context as we can provide. And we'll be working with a prayer method today that might be familiar to some of you, called Lectio Divina. So this divine reading of a sacred text has many, many different forms. I'm quite confident that every tradition has its own method of engaging prayerfully and contemplatively with its sacred scripture. This is one form of an approach that I learned as a young divinity student, that I have learned, that I have used in groups for 20 years of my own ministry. And it's a very simple formula in engaging a sacred text and allowing the wisdom of that text to speak directly to your heart and mind. And it really assumes that there's a kind of surplus of meaning, as our scripture scholars have long told us, that there's not only one hermeneutical choice when we approach a text. In fact, there is a whole surplus, near infinite surplus of meaning. And this particular contemplative method is one way of unlocking wisdom's message for us in particular, individually today. So I will read the text 3 times. The text, of course, is an excerpt from Merton's poem, Hagia Sophia. And I'll invite you, if you're so moved, upon the first reading to listen for one word from the poem that resonates with you. And then we'll have some silence. And then I'll reread the text, and this time I'll invite you to listen for a phrase that might include that first word that resonated the first time, or it might be a completely new phrase that echoes. And then we'll enter some silence again. And I'll invite you to reflect on the phrase. And then I'll read the passage 1/3 time, and I'll invite you to reflect on, what does the text speak to your heart today? And if you feel so moved, I might even widen that question to include, what does the text speak to your heart today in light of a pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement? This is a text that is in some ways a mystical text. But given Merton's reconciliation of the contemplative and the mystical tradition on the one hand, with his life of social action, I think it's very appropriate, in fact, that we take a mystical text and we apply it to the pressing issues of our day. Okay. So I'll invite you to kind of be comfortable. If your posture needs a little bit of adjustment, this is a moment. We'll kind of be in this Lectio Divina for, I don't know, about 5 or 7 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for discussion afterward. You may wish to lower the gaze or close the eyes. I'm sharing the text here on my screen for the visual learners among us who really want to read along as I lead us in this prayer. And to prepare our hearts and minds to receive these words, I invite you just to take a moment and breathe with great care and intention. And remember that the great breath of God is, in fact, breathing through our lives at this very moment. Trusting that the very breath of the divine is animating our own breath, sustaining our own life, and holding us in infinite care. And if it feels supportive, letting this breath hold us and support us throughout our listening, throughout our receiving of this wisdom that's come through the ages, through Thomas Merton to our ears. Letting the breath be a kind of way of opening the heart, opening the mind. Trusting that the very act of listening itself is a radical act of humility, admitting that there is yet still more to learn. And as we hear these words, listening for one particular word that resonates with you this day. There is in all things an invisible fecundity, a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This mysterious unity and integrity is wisdom and mother of all. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a font of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. This is at once my own being, my own nature, and the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, speaking as my sister, wisdom. I am awakened, I am born again at the voice of this, my sister, sent to me from the depths of the divine fecundity. So finding that one word, and taking a moment to let it echo in silence within us. And now listening for a phrase that speaks to your heart. There is in all things an invisible fecundity, a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This mysterious unity and integrity is wisdom, the mother of all. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is the font of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. This is at once my own being, my own nature, and the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, speaking as my sister, wisdom. I am awakened. I am born again at the voice of this, my sister, sent to me from the depths of the divine fecundity. and allowing whatever phrase resonated within you to repeat if it wants, repeating almost like a mantra silently within us. If you feel so moved, perhaps bringing the repetition of this phrase in alignment with the breath, and just letting whatever wisdom from the divine that would like to permeate to the roots of your spirit and your soul, letting it trickle down within you. And one last time hearing these words, Hagia Sophia, and this time listening for what wisdom you think this is speaking to your heart practically today. What meaning, in the light of all that's happening in our world, is being awakened in you. There is in all things an invisible fecundity, a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This mysterious unity and integrity is wisdom, the mother of all. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a font of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. This is at once my own being, my own nature, and the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, speaking as my sister, wisdom. I am awakened. I am born again, the voice of this, my sister, sent to me from the depths of the divine fecundity. So I'm going to stop our screen share in the brief moments that we have left. I did just invite, does anyone feel moved to share what a passage like this, a kind of classically contemplative and mystical text, might be speaking to you today, especially in the midst of everything that's unfolding in our world? Yeah, Jamie.
I was moved by the font of action, which was the phrase that resonated with me, as well as the hidden wholeness. Those two together came to me as very meaningful in this time.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. You see this great theme of Merton trying to weave together the contemplative dimension again, the monastic tradition, which has not traditionally been an activist tradition, had not traditionally, at least for much of the Middle Ages, been committed to social justice. And yet Merton is seeing the monastic tradition as uniquely equipped in Christianity to speak out in critique of the world, which is, of course, its desert monastic roots, right? The impulse to create monasteries initially was a kind of critique of culture, and it had lost that the teeth of critique, and Merton is trying to actually go back to the source of monasticism and reignite this voice of action that's rooted within the monastic and the contemplative tradition. Yeah, thank you for noticing that.
So I raised my hand. I don't,
Oh, sorry. Yes, Lynette.
Knowledge first. But the word that resonated with me in this season that we're in is awakened. And the phrase that is, I am awakened. And I believe that in this time and season that many of us are being awakened.
Yeah, thank you. So powerful. Linda?
The word that resonated with me, only because I think I have not heard it often these past few months, is sweetness. I need a little sweetness. And it was the last line that really caught my attention, sent to me from the depths of divine fecundity. And so I took that as that the sweetness, that's where the sweetness was coming from for me. With so much going on between pandemic, and I just recently learned my pastor is leaving my church, and with Black Lives Matter and all these things that are happening, sweetness kind of eased my heart right today.
I know that we are up against our usual ending time, David?
This group is very patient. If we go another 5 or 10 minutes, I don't think anyone will, no one will complain.
Okay. I mean, certainly, if you need to quietly move on to other commitments, thank you for your time. We honor that. But for folks who want to continue the conversation, yeah, please. Was there another voice that I heard? Yes, please. Oh, maybe Karen first, and then.
I can jump in. I just put it on the chat, but the word that came to me was gentleness, just because I'm finding that there's such a lack of gentleness. Doesn't matter what side, what faction, where anybody's coming from. I just don't, I long for it. It feels like opening email sometimes is just an assault from many points of view, but that gentleness, that listening is sadly lacking.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, was there another hand? I've lost track.
The phrase that stood out to me, I think, was saluted me with an indescribable humility. I thought it was really interesting to think about sort of the divine or godly force within you as being not something that makes you say oh, I'm so great because I'm part of God, but as something that is a source of humility. And in everything that's going on, I always think humility is a really important thing to strive for, but I think especially with just sort of realizing, I guess for me, some things that have been going on for the whole history of this country that I haven't been as aware of. It takes humility to try my best to learn as much about it and to try to understand others' experiences.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I love that that we have reflection happening in the chat box as well, right? So reflection can happen in both places. There's something that always moves me about this poem, given the historical context, is that Merton, as a Catholic monastic in 1961, writing a poem using the divine feminine, is sadly daring, right? He's sort of he's recontextualizing the Logos tradition, the Greek tradition of kind of naming the divine presence incarnate in Jesus, traditionally in this masculine way, as not only in feminine language with the use of Sophia, wisdom, but he even goes this step further to reframe that this wisdom or this sacred feminine is is my sister. So right, and that, I don't know, it takes it one step further. It feels so intimate. Because in some ways, I don't know what it's like to be in relationship to a divine father or a divine mother, for that matter, but though I'm an only child, I can imagine what it's like to have a sister, and that feels really, tender or intimate in this beautiful way. So that always touches me.
I noticed that as well. Actually, the image or the word for me was mother that stood out, and then paired with sister, mother of all. And I was also really moved by that feminine energy just throughout the entire piece. And I feel like it's interesting to think of mother as something that births you, and then sister is something that's so close to you in that intimate way. Yeah, I'm a twin. I have a twin sister, so it's just like a very special, special bond there. So.
Thank you. Any final, maybe one more, then we'll shift to our closing prayer. You know, an observation that feels important for me, that really is at the kind of core, is at the core and is a fundamental spiritual conviction for me from my own Christianity, though I don't think you need to be Christian to have this conviction, and that is the infinite worth of every human being. And, you know, Merton really names beautifully this kind of overlap between creator and creature, that to be alive for Merton is to participate in the infinite life of God. There is no such thing as separate. Either everything is sacred or nothing is sacred for Merton. And so it's incredibly humbling to recognize, at least in this worldview, that this created world holds the infinite presence of God, and that everyone holds that. Every person is walking around as a kind of participation in the divine. And it's easy to want to, it's easy to miss that, especially in people who don't agree with us or who don't think the same way. Can I see the very presence of God, the presence of wisdom itself in those people who I disagree with? And so it's an honor to pray with you. It's an honor to be moved to awakening, to use Merton's language, an honor to be moved to action, to move to joy and sweetness. Because ultimately, I believe the soundtrack of the revolution will be a joyful one. and so thank you. The prayer of the revolution will be a joyful one as well. And it's been a deep, deep joy for me to pray with you and to share a contemplative practice that's really, really nourished my heart. I hope that it might nourish yours and that you might use it as you go on to serve others in your career. So many, many thanks. And I'll invite whoever has offered to pray our closing prayer to offer that now.
And that would be me. Okay, so our closing prayer is written by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let us pray. God, grant that we wage the struggle with dignity and discipline. Grant that we will love you with all our hearts, souls, and minds, and love our neighbors as we love ourselves, even our enemy neighbors. And we ask you, God, in these days of emotional tension, when the problems of the world are gigantic in extent and chaotic in detail, to be with us in our going out and our coming in our rising up and in our lying down, in our moments of joy and in our moments of sorrow, until the day when there shall be no sunset and no dawn. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Brandon, be sure to look at the chat. There's some very nice love being expressed for your time today. And I hope that you feel our gratitude from all of us for our time together. This has really been a great, great time of community and heartfelt reflection. As is our practice, I'll pause for a minute or two to let those who need to get on to other things in their day move along. And Ida, Mansour, and I will be on the line until 1 for some virtual coffee hour and socializing. Brandon, you are welcome to join us if your schedule allows. And for the rest of you, we will see you next week for our final chapel of the academic year.